Hello, and welcome to this episode of Strange as It Seems, a podcast about history, occultism, espionage, secret societies, mystery, conspiracy, and weirdness high and low. The common denominator is that the topics all embody the strange, that is, something that's unusual or surprising in a way that's unsettling or hard to understand. The aim is to reveal and discuss, but without any definite expectation of explaining or proving anything. Because, more often than not, the closer you look at the strange, the stranger it gets. Okay, so Stephen, we're back. And what are we going to do this time? Well, I'm going to say it up front, just so that everyone is aware of this. No, not to mislead anyone. This episode is not going to deal with UFOs or witches or pretty much anything that might be classified as a cult. Well, there might be one little teeny tiny thing, but it's not going to play an important role in it. So, if you want witches and flying saucers, this is not your episode. So you can come back later. Although it is, I'd say, interesting. So what we're going to be talking about today, pretty much we're going to go back to one of my favorite themes, spies, international espionage and skullduggery. In particular, the focus will be a case from the late 1920s, which involved a man who was then a very important American political figure. In fact, one of the most important political figures in Washington. William Borah, senator from Idaho. And in Idaho, Borah is a kind of, I'm not sure saint is quite the word, but he comes
not
close to that.
Not a folk figure, but it's I'm not a native, so I can't really say, but it seems like it's one of the more prominent sons of Idaho, and that everybody's very proud of that.
Well, I mean, it's not like a recent state has that many, but I mean, that's, Frank Church falls in there, the rest. But Borah was a kind of big deal in that period, and he still is. There are lots of things named after him. So, for instance, it might be worth noting that our school here, my former employer, and where Stephen is currently engaged, is the University of Idaho, which has a Borah Symposium.
Yep.
And it's a kind of annual meeting. People are brought in. It always is supposed to do with the causes of war and the promotion of peace. The topics tend to vary a lot. And a lot of interesting people come in and talk about interesting things. It never actually addresses, solves the problem of war. Yeah. That still seems to persist. But there was a very strong connection between the university that we're both associated with and Borah. So one of the issues about Borah in this affair that came up in the late 1920s actually casts him in a arguably quite negative light. In particular, the accusation that he took money from the Soviets to promote pro-Soviet policies, especially the campaign for American recognition of the communist regime in the 1920s. So that maybe is a little thing to bring in at the very beginning. I think I've mentioned it before. When the Bolsheviks came to power in late 1917, they were not recognized as the actual government of Russia by the United States. And that didn't change until FDR would come into office. It wasn't until, I don't think recognition was formally extended until 1933, and I'm not sure an embassy opened until 1934. So there's a rather long, the whole of the 1920s, the U.S. and Soviet Russia have no direct diplomatic relations. They have indirect diplomatic relations.
Was that acknowledgement because of impending war, this kind of idea that there's going to be a unification between the two sides, or was that just FDR?
Well, a lot of it simply had to do with strenuous resistance in the U.S. Congress and also another important area. I mean, the Bolsheviks represented what? Communism,
right,
the Red Menace.
Yeah.
And if you think of it this way, to be perfectly honest, if you look at the U.S., which is a country, I won't say controlled by Wall Street. I will say heavily influenced its government policies by Wall Street. Yeah, it's controlled. That this was an unpopular idea of recognizing a regime whose whole aim was to obliterate capitalism.
Well, that was my question about why FDR acknowledged them.
Well, you could get lots of answers to that.
Yeah.
Everything from FDR was a secret commie.
I don't think so.
No, that's not the case. Was he kind of soft on secret commies? Yeah, pretty much. I think it was simply a policy that fit better at the time. Well, this was the thing that Borah is arguing for. This is sort of the centerpiece of this is that Borah was, well, let's backtrack a bit. So Borah had actually started out, he was what by profession? A lawyer. And notice the way that I say that, which is not meant to be, not a jibe at the legal profession, but he was a lawyer. And one of the things that he early earned some note for, I think, is the Idaho Attorney General, or at least one of the chief prosecutors. He was in charge of a trial of IWW, that is radical labor leaders, including Big Bill Haywood.
This is around the mines.
This is around. Well, it all begins with, what's it, a story in itself? A former governor of Idaho, a fellow by the name of Steunenberg, was killed by a bomb.
Oh, yes.
Okay. I think somebody put a bomb in his mailbox and he went to collect letters and boom, no more Steunenberg. He wasn't governor at the time. He had been a governor, and he had been, well, antagonistic to the Western Federation of Miners, which was the big union, and a kind of increasingly radicalized union in the area. And there had been the Coeur d'Alene mining war. There was a lot of intense labor agitation and violence in the northern part of the state. And Steunenberg was killed, and it was pretty much assumed that, somebody in the Western Federation of Miners was behind it. A guy named Harry Orchard was arrested for it, and Orchard was basically, and also the Pinkertons were called in. The whole operation was essentially handled by the Pinkertons, who basically offered Orchard incentives to incriminate other members of the mining union, including its leader, in effect, or one of its leaders, William Big Bill Haywood.
Yeah.
And so Borah was subsequently, I think this is around 1907, is the prosecutor at the trial, which is trying to convict. Now, Orchard, by the way, as it turns out, is a completely unreliable witness, because it turns out he was also working for the Mine Owners Association as a spy at the same time that he was a bodyguard for Haywood and others. And the Pinkerton stuff comes out. So nothing he said can be entirely believed. So Borah was the prosecutor. He is prosecuting radical labor leaders. Keep that in mind for later. And he was there acquitted. Later on in 1917, the story sort of will connect. Big Bill Haywood is now part of what is then called the International Workers of the World.
Mm-hmm.
And the IWW, the Wobblies.
Yep.
And in 1917, 1918, they're charged by the Wilson administration with violating the Espionage Act, because they basically opposed conscription. Well, they opposed the whole war in general. And that then leads to a conviction. At some point, Haywood gets out on bail, and he bolts. He leaves the country, and he goes where?
Russia.
Moscow. Yeah. All right. And he lives there for the rest of his life until eventually his death in 1928. So he dies about the time. Big Bill Haywood today is buried next to the Kremlin wall. Well, half of his ashes are buried there, and another half were sent back to be scattered somewhere, I think, in Utah, which was originally where he was.
This is a dumb question.
So
Haywood was a confirmed communist, or was he because the IWW was this mix of like an anarchist, they're all kind of vaguely socialist in whatever they called themselves, but they were, I don't know if they were hardline communists.
A lot of them would go over, that's a subject in and of itself.
Yeah. You don't have to answer.
Well, I just say that the IWW over time particularly after it was kind of crushed. The federal government really turned on that and any kind of radical labor, using the war as a pretext, and then later on
the Pomerades,
the kind of
20s.
A Red Scare, which always makes it sound like there was nothing to be afraid of. I mean, there were red. Okay, it's a real thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a bunch of the State Department.
Well, it's one of the things you find is sometimes the concept is that if you talk about the communists, you're like, talking about aliens or Bigfoot. It's an imaginary thing. Yeah. Okay, all this fear of communism was based upon something that didn't actually exist. It did.
Yeah.
And this isn't to argue it's good, bad, or indifferent. It's just the fact that it did, and there was a policy of expansion. The goal is one world socialist republic and the overthrow, Illuminati style, of all existing governments and the replacement with a single world socialist order.
Yeah.
That's exactly what Leninism aimed for. Then yes, and however realistic that goal was, doesn't mean that there weren't people militantly, aggressively, and in some cases fairly effectively pursuing it. So it is a real thing. So people who were afraid of communists had a real thing to actually be afraid of. But going back, if we can, the point is that Borah really starts out on what would appear to be, he's a government prosecutor. He's most noted for going after these radical labor leaders, even though that he didn't win the case. The guy that he prosecuted later ends up, well, the thing is, from the standpoint of the Wobblies, who were intensely, they were anti-capitalist. Mm-hmm. Okay, I don't think anything better sums up the Wobbly philosophy than one of their songs, which you can find on YouTube, called "Dump the Bosses Off Your Back."
I haven't heard this one.
It's a pretty good song, actually. Like most radical labor songs, it's based on hymns. They simply take those and then add other words to them. But the whole refrain in it is that, if you have any kind of problems, are you living in a shack? That's one of the lines. Well, then the solution to that is to dump the bosses off your back. So it is a straightforward appeal to the overthrow of capitalism and the whole order. So I think Wobblies, if you wanted to get, you're not getting more precise with terminology, you're making it more vague. You can talk about radical syndicalism or anarcho-syndicalists.
Right, yeah, which gets its biggest expression in.
And there is a kind of anarchist flavor to things. I recently think that anarchism is a lot like Gnosticism.
Go on.
It's not so much a thing in of itself, but it's this flavor that tends to permeate and influence other things. That there isn't really a pure form of Gnosticism, arguably, but there's simply the influence of Gnosticism on other things, whether that's Christianity or whatever it might be. And anarchism tends to, there's sort of degrees of it. Mm-hmm. To one form or another. But on the other hand, from the standpoint of a fugitive wobbly, okay, where are you going to go? Where are you going to go to the one case where apparently your people are in power? And it would be an interesting question as to how happy Haywood was in Russia, but he stayed there. But one of the things he suggests is that there is this, he's put one little tiny example that there's a kind of notably strong, if you look closely, American influence or interconnection with the Bolsheviks and the Russian Revolution. Because many, not most, but I think a disproportionate many people who will then, after 1917, play roles in the Soviet government, even fairly high in the administration, were people who they had originated in Russia. They were immigrants in the early part of they were guys who left Latvia or Russia or somewhere else, very often they were Finns or they were Jewish. Some were actually Russian. Mm-hmm. And they came to the U.S. and, they worked in a steel mill in Pennsylvania somewhere or in a newspaper. And then after 1917, they go back. And so it's not unusual to find all of these people John Reed may even make some sort of comment on that, or I may be attributing that to someone else. But another sort of American journalist in Russia right after the revolution would note how many Americans they would meet. Hyphenated Americans,
Right.
but how many Americans would sort of come up. So there is a fair amount of going back and forth. Well, John Reed himself, I mentioned that, is another sort of American radical who goes to Russia and will die there under somewhat maybe unusual circumstances. Well, let me go more to the point. Maybe he was murdered, maybe he wasn't. But that's another episode for another time. So this is the kind of, here again, I'm going to use my favorite word, milieu we're going to get in here today. And I might throw a couple of other things in, how it goes. I think I may have mentioned in previous episodes is that during the 20s and 30s, America's counterintelligence, or at least sort of domestic security situation, was not non-existent, but there wasn't much to it. In terms of actually combating something like espionage or subversive activities, the FBI didn't really do much at that time. And it had some impact. There wasn't, the CIA didn't exist. A lot of other elements of the whole sort of national security apparatus was largely non-existent. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. So Soviet and other espionage, if they wanted to, had a pretty free reign. And one of the interesting things to me is how kind of blatantly obvious these things were. But one case that perhaps we'll get into, and if not, we'll save it for another time, was a counterfeiting case. So things seldom discussed, seldom mentioned, is that around 1928, 1929, a decision was made, supposedly, with Joseph Stalin's personal approval. He wasn't yet Grand Poobah of the whole thing yet, but he's party secretary. His word carried more than anyone else, even in that period. And the idea, one of the problems that the Soviets had, because they were unrecognized by many other governments and other issues, is that, well, their currency wasn't worth anything outside of the country. I mean, that was true for the ruble all the way through. You couldn't take them outside of the country. They weren't exchangeable. There was no mechanism, because nobody could agree upon how much of these would actually be worth against supposedly real currencies. So in order to finance activities abroad, and by what activities am I talking about? Remember what it was the Soviet regime's goal was world revolution. And that meant subsidizing communist parties all around the world, subsidizing the production of propaganda, paying for information. That is, paying the upkeep on agents, and then also paying people to get the information or get things that you wanted in the West, like recognition. Okay, this recognition was, once you get recognized, that it simplifies a whole variety of other things. Makes it much easier to do business, makes it easier to operate in that regard. So that's where Borah comes back into the picture, because he'd been elected to the Senate. I think he's in the Senate for something like 33 years. Anyway, a long time. And from 1922, maybe 1924, early 20s, through 1933, he becomes head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
Which, oddly enough, there's been, 3 senators from Idaho who've been head of the Senate Foreign Relations?
Yeah, it was Church.
I think it was Church, and then who's, is it Risch? Recently?
Would have been. I don't know.
But
I really don't keep up on that.
Well, it's a claim to fame over there at the Borah Symposium, or the group, the Martin Institute that runs.
Okay.
It. And so, yeah.
Well, hooray for Idaho.
The question I have is why? Why us? Why such a small? Yeah, maybe you'll get into that with explaining how Borah amasses power in the Senate. You know what I mean?
Well, that probably has to do more with personality than anything else. So Borah, well, I don't know. I never met the guy.
Well, I'm thinking,
and no one alive today has. So the impression you get is that was Borah a saint? Well, no, but then nobody is. So he was constantly. This is an interesting thing. Really, a U.S. senator didn't, from his likes, make that. Now, keep in mind, he's a fairly successful man.
Okay,
he's an attorney. He goes on. He could have had a successful legal practice in Boise or elsewhere. It was his election to the Senate and to Congress, which brought him to Washington. And the thing is that it's a lot more expensive even then to live in D.C. than it is in Boise.
Right.
So he was always complaining that there just wasn't enough money.
Yeah.
So just remember that. Someone who's constantly griping about the fact that their government isn't paying them enough money for this. So he liked money, didn't think that he had enough of it. He was also supposedly kind of, what was the term that used to be used for this? Womanizer.
Oh.
Okay. He was not altogether faithful to his wife and was noted to have affairs, sometimes with married women. What can we say? That's in terms of the general sea of human sin or foibles, that's kind of commonplace. That simply tends to me make him sound like a relatively normal human being. And therefore, I would neither ascribe saintly nor diabolical qualities to him based on that. And therefore, as a normal human being, a human being who would be susceptible to all the things that normal human beings are susceptible to. So by the early 1920s, he's connected. He's a Republican, the Republican Party, the progressive wing of the Republican Party, which, as strange as that may seem to many today, back in the 20s was that's where you actually the only sort of group where you could find kind of any kind of, I wouldn't even say friendliness, but willing to deal with the Bolsheviks was probably among progressive Republicans. La Follette would be an example of that.
Is this Taft? Is he part of this?
I don't think so. I think he's just
a
like regular
business guy. Well, I know he's Roosevelt, and I always think Roosevelt as far as Teddy, as a progressive, but.
And the support for that, I mean, the basic argument was this. There were those on Wall Street and elsewhere who found the Bolsheviks basically the devil incarnate, and that there was no way that we could have any kind of relations with them. On the other hand, there were people, including quite a few on Wall Street, surprising how many capitalists were extremely eager to do business with the Soviets, among them Henry Ford. Right. So it might be noted that Henry Ford, no friend to organized labor, I don't think he would ever be accused of that, was nevertheless the first American capitalist, as far as I can tell, to jump on the Bolshevik bandwagon. He was going to sell them whatever they wanted by any means he could get it to them. This also was an early example of where what we call sanctions don't work, because all it does, it doesn't eliminate the exchange, it just increases the price of it. There's always someone who's going to come in and, okay, if somebody wants to buy something, someone's going to sell it to them. Every drug dealer knows that. So if nobody wanted to buy it, okay, there wouldn't be anything there. So Borah is in a position, he's a fairly well-respected figure. I mean, people seem to like him. There's some talk about, potential presidential candidacy.
Really?
So Borah was a man who was seriously discussed, at least within the Republican Party, as being a presidential candidate.
Huh.
And that was something that never came to pass, but that would be an idea. So remember, in the 20s, the idea that this man, who's currently the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who has a considerable clout, or at least influence in terms of foreign policy, who can actually push the agenda of recognition fairly effectively. This is also a guy who could, a few years down the road, become president. Now, from the standpoint of Moscow, from Lenin's standpoint, later from Stalin's standpoint, you really want recognition by the United States. And the idea of being able to have a friend, someone who would, well, by a friend, I mean someone who would promote policies in the Soviet interest. Well, that would be great if they were in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, but if they could become president, that would be even more important. That's exactly the kind of friends that we need. So this is what it brings us to. Here's the kind of central mystery, or the issue in this, is that Borah does become head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and I think it must be that because it's in 1922 that he introduces his first bill for the recognition of the Soviet Union. That bill doesn't pass, as do neither any of the other attempts until FDR would come along. So Borah's never really successful in this period, but he's always keeping the issue alive. And from the Soviet standpoint, they like what he's doing, and they want him to continue. So at the center of this is I guess we could say, one particular document, which may be real or it may not be real. Or let's say there may be a real version of the fake version which showed up, but that itself is uncertain. So what it is a kind of receipt dated the 7th of March, 1926, in which, and it's signed, apparently, although of course there's questions about the legitimacy of the signature, by William E. Borah, as a kind of receipt for the sum of $100,000. A payment which was made in Paris through the intermediary of an American lawyer, a kind of radical American lawyer by the name of Dudley Field Malone. Okay. Also, international divorce lawyer. And a man who bore an uncanny resemblance to Winston Churchill.
Oh.
Yeah, who would later on play Winston Churchill in 3 different movies.
Really?
So, because, this guy looks like Churchill. So what the hell does Dudley Field Malone, international divorce lawyer, have to do with this? Why is he the intermediary in this regard? But this acknowledges payment from the Soviets of $100,000.
Wow.
Which was a lot of money in the 1920s. Now, the interesting thing is that Borah is not the only senator who's accused of this. George Norris from Nebraska, who'd also supported the recognition idea, also supposedly took $100,000. Now, the interesting thing to me is that Norris is almost never mentioned. Okay, so Borah and Norris's name are mentioned together as 2 senators who took $100,000 payoffs from the Bolsheviks to promote pro-Soviet policies in Washington, especially American recognition. Borah, I think, I don't even know that Norris even made any particular response to this. I mean, he must have, but there's really no, apart because Borah was simply the bigger figure. I mean, this was something, he was a recognizable national political figure, where I don't think, with all respect to Nebraska, that Norris was at that time. So no one seems to have paid much attention to it. But notice there were really 2 senators who were accused of taking these bribes. Borah did have political enemies. We'll come to that. And there will be not one, there will be 3 different iterations of this accusation. So in 3 different cases, maybe referencing the same documents, there you will have some sort of documentary evidence that will be produced, none of it ever verified, which says that Borah took $100,000 or some undefined amount of money to advance recognition and other pro-Soviet policies in Washington. So what this sort of segues us up to, we're going to go ahead and then we're going to go back a little bit, is we're going to go to the 1st of July, 1929, in Berlin, Germany. And a trial opens at a Berlin court. And the trial is, the accused are basically two men, two Russian émigrés. That is, Russians who had supposedly fled Bolshevik Russia and were living abroad. One of them was a fellow by the name of Vladimir Grigorievich Orlov. We'll call him Orloff. And the other was a Mikhail Pavlovsky. At least that's what he's called in court. But as was noted in the court, he has many names. Sumarokov, Yashin, Yakshin, Karpov, all the same guy. Why does he have so many names? Well, because he's played a number of different roles. So here's a little interesting detail. Pavlovsky, until 1924, 5 years earlier, had been an employee of the Soviet government. What kind of an employee? He'd been an officer of the Cheka, of the secret police.
Interesting.
And in fact, he'd worked as an infiltrator in sort of various counter-revolutionary groups. And then supposedly in 1924, he had been discharged. He'd been a Soviet intelligence officer assigned to the embassy in Berlin. And in 1924, he'd supposedly been dismissed for theft. That may be true. I doubt if it is. And he then gravitated to the other side, and he became a kind of partner with the guy that I just mentioned, Vladimir Orlov. Who was Vladimir Orlov? Well, Vladimir Orlov had started out as an attorney and as essentially as a kind of prosecutor under the Tsarist regime, particularly in the prosecution of political cases, that is, of revolutionaries. And early on in his career, one of the revolutionaries whose capture and I think in one case whose interrogation he handled was a Polish Bolshevik by the name of Felix Dzerzhinsky. And Felix Dzerzhinsky, who was he? Well, he was the guy who would become the head of the Cheka. He would become the founder. Wow. Think of it this way. He's the daddy of the KGB. Wow. The whole Soviet secret police system was based around Dzerzhinsky. And this was a guy that Orlov had early on in his career arrested. You know, he'd sat across the table asking Dzerzhinsky questions. And then, of course, the world turned. And after 1917, as a Tsarist prosecutor, Orlov loses his job. And he ends up in a Cheka office sitting across the table from Dzerzhinsky, who's now interrogating him. Now, you might suppose that Dzerzhinsky would get even with Orlov by putting him up against the wall and having him shot. But no, Dzerzhinsky was a person who recognized talent. And so what he offered Orlov was a job working for the Cheka. So it turns out that Orlov, early in his career, 1918 or so, is also working for Bolshevik intelligence. Now, he eventually, he argues he quits. He was never a real Bolshevik. He just did that to stay alive, which is believable. That's not to say true, but it is believable. It's an acceptable argument. And then Orlov went on later to go over to the Whites, and he's for this white general and that white general. He's an intelligence director. And then later ends up in Berlin, running something which I founded in 1920, which he calls the Anti-Bolshevik Intelligence Service. Huh. It's a private spy service.
Oh. And
he supposedly, because Orlov's whole argument is this. See, he argues, I used to work for the Cheka. And I still know people, even though it's changed its names, the GPU, it's the OGPU, again, it'll all eventually be the KGB. That I know people there and I still have contacts. So I have sources and I can get information directly from Soviet intelligence files. And this was the type of stuff that he sold to various Western governments, especially the Germans. German intelligence was, and this is one of the things that would come out at this trial we're going to discuss, would admit that Orlov had basically been on their payroll for years because he supplied them with information about communist Soviet activity, particularly their activity with the German Communist Party, which they wanted to keep track of. And it wasn't as if they entirely trusted him, but he was available to do that. And this is then when Pavlovsky, this other sort of GPU, Soviet intelligence officer, seemingly gets kicked out, defects. He goes to work for Orloff. So they're now on the other side, and they're using their sources, their private spy system inside the USSR to feed information to Western intelligence. That's one version of it. The other version of it is that they're all Soviet agents feeding information and disinformation. That is, they're Reds pretending to be Whites.
Yeah.
Which happens a lot. Another thing that it vastly increases my suspicion is that Orloff is also closely associated with whom? In fact, had known whom since Sidney Riley. Okay, we've talked about before. The not so really heroic British anti-communist spy who again ends up working for the Soviets to one degree or another. It's Riley, for instance, who will convince the British, who will eventually convince MI6 to take Orlov on as a regular source that they codename Z51. Because Riley convinces him that Orlov's stuff is gold. He's got all of these contacts, and you should pay him for the information he can supply you about all the insidious commie plots that are being hatched. And MI6, SIS properly, does that until, of course, eventually even they catch on that Riley is really working for the other side. So here a case of where I think you've got one Soviet agent recommending another Soviet agent for a job and getting his employee. So Orlov's whole loyalty in this, his position in this whole dispute is questionable. He's going to paint himself as a victim of Bolshevik intrigues. He's going to accuse everyone else on the other side of being a communist or a communist dupe, and that he's the only innocent man in the whole affair. But, we'll see. We'll come back and revisit that question once we've gone through the course of events. So Orlov and Pavlovsky are on trial that day, the 1st of July, 1929, in Berlin, basically on the charge of fraud. And the fraud in this case was selling bogus documents to an American journalist who was based in Berlin. And this was a fellow by the name of Hubert Renfro Knickerbocker, better known to his friends as Red Knickerbocker. Now, is that because of his political inclinations? No, it was because of his bright red hair, just like Stevens. And just like Steven, he came from Texas.
Oh, no, golly.
Yes. So Knickerbocker, born around the turn of the century, he initially wanted to be a doctor. Okay, left Texas, went to New York, went to Columbia University to study medicine. That cost too much. So he decided, what's the next best thing I can do? Lawyer? No, I'll be a journalist. Okay. So he went to the Columbia School of Journalism, got a degree, and then pretty much, I think, went to work for the Hearst Syndicate. Okay. That school he ended up working for. Okay. And from around, I think from 1923 to 1933, he's based mostly in Berlin. And he reports for the Philadelphia Ledger, the New York Evening News, later the Hearst International News Service. A fairly interesting character. Was from Yoakum, Texas. And while based in Berlin, he would also cover Moscow. So, for instance, I think for the Ledger, the New York Evening News, in 28, and when he actually interviews Stalin's mother, first person ever to do that.
Awesome.
She would tell him that even I don't know my son. So he didn't get a whole lot out of her. He will later on interview Stalin as well. Knickerbocker's politics, and this is something we've got to do in this case. You have to look at what people's politics are. Knickerbocker's politics are kind of hard to pin down. He certainly didn't like Hitler. And it was probably, he seems to have disliked Hitler more than he disliked the Nazis.
Interesting.
Because he actually would interview, I think around 30, something in the early 30s, Gregor Strasser.
I was about to say, is he a Strasser?
Right. He interviewed Strasser, and now Gregor Strasser was Hitler's main rival in the Nazi Party.
Yeah, they were like the left of.
Yes, they were kind of the Bolshevik wing of the Nazi Party. They took this whole socialism part.
They were actually
seriously.
like into the and
they thought Hitler was a sellout to the generals and the capitalists, which he was.
Which
is the key to his success in many ways. So it's interesting that Knickerbocker really disliked Hitler, would give a kind of favorable interview to Hitler's rival, and he also seemed to like Mussolini, because he wrote this whole thing about going to fascist Italy and talking about what a great place it was, which oddly enough seems to have been a widespread opinion. A lot of people went to Mussolini's Italy and thought, this is great.
Yes, I mean, it's
the trains run on time.
Yeah.
So Knickerbocker, there were some who could argue that he seemed to be kind of pro-fascist. Others, he clearly was anti-Nazi. He wasn't in any way outwardly pro-communist. Now, he did get access to the Soviet beat. That is, he would go back to Moscow several times, and if the Soviets didn't like him, if they viewed him as a hostile element, that is, a reporter who would not report things the way they wanted them to, they wouldn't have let him back in. So the fact that he returns repeatedly to Russia, that he gets interviews with Stalin's mother, who certainly Stalin knew about, and will later interview other high officials and Stalin himself, they must have viewed him favorably. They had nothing against him, and certainly thought that he's someone whose reporting could be useful to them. They're not doing this because they would like him, but only to the degree to which this could be useful to them. So Knickerbocker, on the scale of things, probably veered more to the left than he did to the right. He's also a very ambitious reporter. Later he'll go on to write, in 1931, he actually writes a whole book based on a series of articles about Stalin's first 5-year plan.
Oh, really?
And it's also titled, sometimes just the first 5-year plan, other cases like the Russian industrial menace. Okay. But this was the whole gist of the article. The article certainly recognized that there was coercion and terror involved in this, but it also made a lot about this zealousness of the Bolsheviks. That there were people who were completely driven by ideology, and even though that wasn't most of the population, the people in control were absolutely convinced of these ideas, and then they were to pursue them no matter what. And he thought it was going to work. So one of the things that Knickerbocker actually predicted fairly accurately is that for all of the issues with the 5-year plans during the 1930s, I mean, you could go back and pick them apart in terms of how inefficient they were otherwise. They did overall have a tremendous impact. They turned Russia from a minor industrial power into a major industrial power in a decade.
Yeah.
They hugely increased the productive power of Soviet industry. And that's exactly what it was that Knickerbocker, in his 1931 book, predicted would happen. That's why he saw this as a menace to Western industry, because now Soviet industry was going, to develop and no longer, we're not going to have to buy tractors from the West anymore, because we can manufacture them on our own under license. They're all Ford tractors. And so the question is, well, the tone of that book makes this sound as if it does sort of accurately predict what's going to happen. And I don't think that prediction would have been frowned upon in Moscow. Because one, it was arguing that this plan is going to succeed, which they very much wanted to put forward the picture for, and that furthermore, this is something you should probably be afraid of. This is kind of advertising the potential of Soviet power. So my suspicion would be is that that Renfrew Knickerbocker, Hubert,
He's just
red Knickerbocker is what I was trying to say there. Is that Red Knickerbocker was probably a little bit more red than he let on. I think that was part of it was there. Now, there's something else that I find interesting about this. His friendship with one other journalist, a fellow by the name of Walter Duranty.
Oh, I don't know.
Well, Walter Duranty is... I should mention, by the way, that Knickerbocker actually won a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on the 5-year plans. Similar in the way in which Walter Duranty would win a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting around the same time on what Duranty called the mythical famine in Ukraine and other areas of the USSR. So here's one of the things we know about Walter Duranty. Walter Duranty was, again, an ambitious journalist, probably not so much political as amoral. He was the kind of dean of Western reporters in Moscow. So anybody who came there would you'd either be rebuffed by him. Well, here's an interesting thing. One of the ways they used to judge Western journalists who showed up in Moscow was what Duranty thought on them, because that becomes part of his job as a secret police informant. He keeps the Soviet police informed about Western journalists and their political opinions and whether or not they can be useful. If Duranty didn't like you, it's unlikely you would get to talk to anybody. So that, again, the whole thing of Knickerbocker later being able to interview Stalin's mother was due in part to his relationship with Duranty. And Duranty is an effective agent of the government and secret police. He does that for a lot of reasons. One of which is that the Cheka, let's call him that for lack of a better name at this point, his wife is a junkie, and they make sure that she gets the finest grade heroin from Manchuria. Just to sort of keep him happy in that regard. Duranty, this came, the degree to which Duranty later on essentially denied, he painted a very positive picture of what was happening under collectivization and emphasized that there was no famine and that people who basically said they were either hallucinating or they were just, anti-Soviet zealots in one form or another. That led later to some accusations that his Pulitzer Prize might be rescinded, but it turns out you can't actually do that. I mean, you got him at the time for what you did, and we're not going to, because if we had to look at his case, then we might have to look at others.
First draft of history.
But no, it was respected. But Duranty is clearly in the Soviet camp, and so he's very good friends. He takes Knickerbocker under his wing, gets him the entrees into interviewing people in the Soviet elite, I think, which raises a reasonable question as to whether or not Knickerbocker was following Duranty in the regards of actively cooperating with Soviet authorities, which is to say, the secret police. Now, why would that be? I mean, maybe even beyond the idea of reporting things in a way that they wanted them reported. So, as I said, Orloff and Pavlovsky are on trial for selling essentially fraudulent documents to Knickerbocker. And these documents, supposedly, what did these documents show? Well, that Borah and Norris had taken $100,000 from the Soviets. So, where did Knickerbocker get this whole idea? Why did he go after this particular story? Well, this whole thing actually goes back. The first accusation that Borah was, let's say it was in Soviet pay, goes back to late 1927, almost 2 years earlier. And at that time, there was a U.S. Senate committee headed by Senator David Reed of Pennsylvania, which was investigating charges of potential bribery or influence among members of Congress. And Borah and Norris's name first came up then, and what they were referring to were things called the Paris documents. Now, these documents, keep in mind, had basically been obtained from unknown sources in Paris. And these documents included what I mentioned earlier, that 7th March 1926 receipt, supposedly signed by Borah through Dudley Field Malone, the American lawyer there, and acknowledging the receipt of $100,000. Now, the documents on hand, the document that Reed and his committee had in front of them, were acknowledged to be copies. They were not the originals. They were photostats. And whoever had the originals said that they would provide them for $50,000. So this was some unknown person or persons in Paris who said that we've got the real documents proving that Borah and Norris took money from the Reds, but you'll have to pay us $50,000 to get them. Well, an examination of the copied documents suggested that everything about them, including Borah's signature, was unconfirmable or questionable. There wasn't any way that Congress was going to come up with $50,000. And so it was eventually determined that this was nothing more, that these were forgeries, and that the case was dropped. But of course, not everyone was satisfied. So here, let me point out, Borah had his political enemies. And his political enemies were mostly people in what might be termed the capitalist elite, who were not happy, didn't want to sell tractors to the Soviets, and that thought that his policies were bad. And there were a number of people who didn't like him. And we're gonna circle back to this. Remember these Paris documents. So one of the questions is, where did the Paris documents come from? So remember, they're only sort of copies. But they do exist. The documents themselves are not mythical. So whether the real ones were any more, supposedly the copies themselves didn't pass muster. But it's also not clear to me that they get terribly close examination. I mean, what it looks like to me is that Reed's committee wanted this whole thing to go away as quickly as possible. And the idea is that we're not going to pay you $50,000 for the real ones, and the copies don't look good to us, and so that we're going to dismiss this as some sort of dirty political trick which is being played. Now, so that's back in late 1927, early 1928. Now, for some reason, about a year later, that is in early 1929, Hubert Knickerbocker, based as a correspondent in Berlin, decides that he somehow gets this story that there are sources in Berlin who can provide documents that either the same documents that had been offered in Paris or documents that would support what the Paris documents said. So Knickerbocker, for some reason, wants to jump into this story and a year or so after it's dropped off the headlines. So he starts trying to make contact with these people. And first he contacts a guy by the name of Felix Dassel. Sounds like a German name, and it is a German name. But Felix Dassel was an ethnic German from the former Russian Empire. He came from the Baltic states. So he's actually another kind of white Russian émigré, in this case, a white Russian German émigré. He also works for the German political police. So he's an informant to that. And now because of that, remember I said that Orloff in Berlin supplied a lot of information on communist activities to the German police, the German political police, particularly this thing called Abteilung 1.
What?
Okay. The Abteilung. Okay. That is apparent. This is some sort of, it also seems to have another name, Nuntia. I'd never heard that name until it just comes up in the trial. But literally, in the course of this trial. Now, by the way, the trial that starts on the 1st of July will continue for about 3 weeks. It continues, I think, the 22nd of July. Okay. And at one point, there's all kinds of things that happen in the proceedings. There's one person that seems to have some sort of mental breakdown and lapse into an amnesiac coma.
Okay.
Right on the stand. Now, it's either because they had some sort of psychic background or because they had been told to stop talking.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that becomes clear throughout this is that Orloff, the other accused, Pavlovsky, Dassel, who's one of the witnesses, another witness against them, a fellow by the name of Harold Sievert, that all of them have connections to the German political police, to the Abteilung, which is apparently the most secret element of that, and which I think is the same thing as Nuntia, because the minute the word Nuntia is mentioned, the whole proceedings stop.
Huh.
Okay, that was like something that was never supposed to be mentioned at all. So basically what you had was there's a kind of agency for the maintenance of public order. Then within that is a special section, Abteilung 1, and then Nuntia is either the same thing, but Abteilung 1 was a hush-hush element of the German political police specifically focused on political activities. So they were very interested in the activities of communists or anyone else, any other sort of subversion in a way. So it was the secret police of the secret police.
Is this kind of like why Hitler was sent to infiltrate? I mean, that was military, but...
Well, the Abteilung later will to some degree morph into the Gestapo.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
All right.
It actually is connected to things that later becomes this. One of the things that happens during the Weimar regime is that agencies change their names frequently. And things are supposed... So you'll get a socialist regime, a socialist prime minister... who will ban things. Like at one point, this Bureau for the Maintenance of Public Order, which I'm not getting the name exactly right, is banned by one of the socialist governments during the Weimar era. But then it will just come back in some other form. And there's a great deal of suspicion that the Abteilung is spying on everyone in German politics, which they certainly are. But on the other hand, because of that, it's almost this kind of shadowy thing that may or may not exist. But Orloff, Pavlovsky, those testifying on their behalf and against them almost always seem somehow to be connected to the German political police, which the German political police don't like being talked about. So there's an effort also to try to get this trial. A lot of people in Berlin aren't happy that this trial is happening at all. So the trial itself is fairly lively. So what it was that Knickerbocker, through Felix Dassel, gets an introduction to Pavlovsky. I'm not sure whether Knickerbocker and Orloff ever meet face to face, but Pavlovsky goes, "Oh, you want stuff on Borah? We can get you stuff on Borah. Okay, you'll have to pay us something for it." I don't think the price was exorbitant. And basically, what Orloff and Pavlovsky provide is kind of a dupe of the Paris documents. There are a few things that are different. Now, again, Orloff emphasizes these are recreations of the original documents, because he says that these original documents, I've got a copy here of this 7th March receipt, but the copy I've got didn't come from Paris. The copy I got came from Cheka archives in Moscow.
Interesting.
Okay, because that's where this is filed, and that's where my special agents are, my magic elves who are out there collecting all of these things. But see, they can't, there's no copying machines, and, cameras are discouraged at work in the secret police. And so what they do is they copy by hand the memos, the documents they find, and then they smuggle them to me. And then what I do in my lab here in Berlin is I reconstruct those documents. Now, this is the same stuff that Orloff had been selling to the German political police, to the Abteilung, and also to the British and the French and others. Even some American representatives in Berlin bought stuff from Orloff because he had this kind of factory of documents. And most people weren't terribly certain about them because it looked a lot like a document mill. Mm-hmm. And how could he really, but he was providing stuff that could be, and which some often checked out, which of course is the first thing you do with disinformation. Most of it should check out. That's what you want them to do. You're going to give them real stuff, and when they check it out, it will seem to be real, so you can then slip them the Mickey.
Right.
You can include the stuff which is not true, but which will then get passed because the other stuff seems to be accurate. So Orloff is a questionable commodity, but he's useful. And all of these German and foreign intelligence services are using him to one degree. And what Orloff will argue is that, well, he's the victim of this. This is what he's doing. He's now an enemy. His spy system inside Moscow is collecting all of these documents, and so now the Cheka is trying to get me, and so they've basically gotten this guy, this American reporter, who we know has been in and out of Moscow and therefore was probably approached or in some way compromised by them. He's just been using as their front man, first of all, to solicit these documents from me. He came to me and asked for them. I gave him the documents. I told him that the documents were only reconstructions of the originals. And now he's had, Knickerbocker got the documents, went around to look at to different experts and determined that indeed these were not legitimate documents of any kind. But again, Orloff is arguing that I never said they were the original. Well, maybe he's not saying that now, but they are, what they were based on is real, but they are reconstructions. And of course, the plaintiff, Knickerbocker, is saying is that I wanted, real documents, and this is forgery. Okay, reconstructed documents that's just another way of saying that they're forgeries. They're not legitimate, and I want my money back. So what did the court eventually decide after 3 weeks of testimony and breakdowns on the stand, and various things edited out of the record because it involves sensitive issues? They sentenced Orloff and Pavlovsky. They found them guilty. They sentenced them to 4 months in jail, which they'd already served because they were arrested back in March. And so they were just released. Huh. And a small fine. Oh, and then they were exiled from Prussia, which meant that they were exiled from most of Germany. Right. Okay, which was the biggest part of Germany was Prussia. Orloff will stay in, I think he'll go to Bavaria for a while. Then eventually he'll go to Brussels, which he'll stay in up until through World War II, during the course of which he returns to Berlin and is found murdered in the Tiergarten. Okay. Executed by a bullet in the back of the neck.
Suicide. That sounds like suicide.
Yeah, that's what you do. Yeah. So whether he was killed by the Gestapo, late in the Nazi regime, whether he was killed by the Soviets, whether he was killed by somebody else, he'd screwed over a lot of people in his lifetime. Yeah. But the thing about Orloff is that Orloff is a Soviet asset, and that's what he's doing. His whole sort of mill in Berlin is just that. It is a disinformation mill, which is selling relatively inconsequential stuff. The Soviets are letting out some unimportant secrets along with things that are going to mislead the consumers of this, because the consumers of it are foreign intelligence agencies. So that's one of the things you want to achieve. You want to find a means, get someone who can sell fake stuff to the opposition. So here you've got Orloff at the trial, who is a Soviet asset complaining that he is being persecuted by Soviet agents. It's just the perfect scenario, because that's how it is that he's going to defend himself. But the other thing is that Knickerbocker himself may have been consciously or unconsciously, I suspect consciously, a Soviet asset as well. So explain to me how this would work. You've got Knickerbocker, arguably influenced by Duranty in his collaboration with the Soviets, who decides to bring charges against another Soviet asset for selling him documents that he knows are fake to begin with. And so you've got one Soviet asset accusing another Soviet asset of crime.
Yeah.
So why would they do that? Why is this whole thing apparently being stage managed from Moscow? What would be the reason? Well, that takes us to another sort of related gambit which is going on in the intelligence domain in this period. Something else which Soviet intelligence initiated in around 1921, 1922 was a multifaceted operation, which is usually described as the trust or the trest. So that term gets thrown around a lot, and you can read books about espionage in this period that will talk about the Soviet trust, and it will be described as one of the most successful and elaborate disinformation campaigns in history. It will be described as an utter failure. Maybe it was something of both in some ways, but it's trust itself is a kind of blanket term for a number of different operations that were going on. They all had pretty much the same aim. The basic conceit of the trust, the sort of story behind it, the backstory, was that not all was happy in the workers' paradise. That there were underground opposition groups, both within the Communist Party and outside of it. That is, there were dissident groups within the Communist Party, which, by the way, is entirely true.
Yeah,
there was disagreement within the Communist Party, especially disagreement with between the followers of Trotsky and increasingly those of Stalin. So that's not imaginary. Now, does that bring us to the Trotskyites? Are they? That's kind of another story, but kind of. All right. So that element was there. See, there's enough in that to attract your attention. If you were a foreign intelligence officer, whoever it was, who's paying attention to Soviet politics, you know that there is unrest and there is opposition. And then, of course, there are the groups outside the Communist Party, the anti-communist groups, the monarchists.
Yeah.
Okay. And one of these groups was supposedly the Monarchist Association of Monarchist Organization of Central Russia, the Mutzer. And that was one of the groups that abroad would go to monarchist émigrés, people living in Berlin or Paris or elsewhere, San Francisco. There were a lot of them there. Hollywood. There was a whole little colony there, and go to them to say, we're representatives of this secret monarchist underground, and we're going to restore the Tsar, and we actually have allies within the dissident ranks of the Communist Party. Well, the Monarchist Organization of Central Russia did not exist other than as a wholly owned, created subsidiary of the Cheka.
Okay.
All right. It was purely a secret police invention.
All these shell groups.
Now, it did actually involve some people who were sincere monarchists. You need a few of those.
Yeah.
So they think that they're part of a monarchist organization, but they're not. All of the key decision making, the reason why they are allowed to exist, is so that they can then go abroad and try to convince other monarchists that, yeah, your guys are here, so you should cooperate. Hear anything interesting? We need all of that. You have any friends? Now, Here's something else. Western intelligence agencies, not the Americans, because they weren't doing much of any of this. They didn't really have one, so to speak. But the British, the French, the Germans, others, all are heavily dependent upon white Russian émigrés as agents and sources of information.
Okay.
Remember, an example of that is Sidney Riley himself. Remember, he may have an Irish name, but he's Irish.
Yeah.
And so he himself is another expatriate Russian, or at least born in the Russian Empire, who is now posing as a friend of Western intelligence. So Western intelligence agencies tended to recruit from and rely upon information, but like Orloff is an example of this. Orloff sells himself as an anti-communist, and he points to his work as a czarist magistrate and prosecutor. He doesn't point out his work for the Cheka a couple of years later. And the whole aim, so often it's argued that the goal of the trust was to gain influence and control over foreign emigre organizations. And the Mensheviks had a foreign organization, the ones who lost out to the Bolsheviks. There are anarchists who have this type of thing. You have the liberal Democrats. You have, the representatives of the old Duma. You have the industrialists. You have all these former Russian capitalists who formed associations, and have a club where they all go and talk about the day they'll all go back and reclaim their factories. Well, what the trust does is it creates these front organizations to appeal to every one of these groups. Everything from from anti-communist leftists to monarchists, to everything in between. So it poses itself as being this organization that can somehow represent all of these kind of dissident groups. They're not really, so far as I can tell, terribly successful in convincing a lot of people in the white emigre community that they're legitimate. Okay. I mean, some of them are successful, but there's always heavy suspicion. And that suspicion is because they've heard this siren song before. You're sitting in Paris and someone shows up from the old country and goes, "Oh, the Bolsheviks' days are numbered. Oh, you just got, you got to help us. We have this whole kind of organization." They're not too certain about that. And the other reality was that the Soviets, from other means, had riddled white emigre organizations with informants. It was like the old in the pre-revolutionary era, is that who in the revolutionary parties isn't informing to the Tsar's secret police? It's not a matter of who was, but almost a question of who wasn't. Yeah. And later on in the 1920s, if you look at the white organizations and elsewhere, they were riddled with people who were collaborating, with the hope of going home. See, that's what it was that the Cheka, or if you want to call them the KGB, could sell. And the reason they could get people, you're a former Russian general under the Tsar. You're now living in Paris. What are you doing in Paris? You're driving a cab. Okay? Yeah. This is one of the things. In the 1920s, it became almost a joke that cab drivers in Paris were Russians and that they were all former dukes or something like that. So you're driving a cab in Paris. You're not living under the despised Bolsheviks, but you have to think it's almost as bad in some way. But someone approaches from the east, maybe your cousin, whatever it was, and they go, "Look, you could go home. You're not going to go back and be a general, but you can go back and you can, live in a dignified position. Nobody's going to do anything to you. You're not going to go to a labor camp or anything else, which you could prove by assisting us. So you can just help us by recommending certain people, saying the right things. Maybe we'll bring you to a trip and you can go back to Russia." And this is one of the things they would do. This is the way to prove that the trust existed. "Look, I can magically sweep you into Soviet Russia and we can travel all around and you can see this place and you can meet with other counter-revolutionaries and no hair in your head will be touched." And it would happen. And they would come back to Paris and go, it was great. I just went everywhere. No, this is a real thing. Well, either that or
to protect. Yeah.
Yeah. The secret police that you think you're avoiding are the ones who are your tour guides.
Yeah.
And that's what was actually going on. But the ultimate goal of these operations wasn't just to influence and control the white organizations abroad. The ultimate goal was to use that as a means to influence the Western intelligence agencies that had allied themselves with the whites. So what we want to do is to send our phony emissaries west. They'll then recruit people among the whites, or they'll lull them over to a belief in our legitimacy. And then those people will pass on the idea that, that there's like this real underground and everything inside Russia, which will attract MI6, the Deuxième Bureau, and the Abteilung, and all of them will become fixated on this. And they'll start pouring money and attention into it. And then, if we work hard enough, we can get our people into those intelligence services. Now, that's where people like Riley had already come very, very close to that. Riley, actually, for a fairly short period of time, is in the employ of MI6. He gets paid money to give them information. And that's only from like 1918 to 1921. But nevertheless, one of the whole things is that he never quite gets inside. I mean, as an outsider, as a foreigner, he's never really going to get into the higher echelons of the organization. And that's where supposedly the realization comes along that you're going to have to recruit native British. So the way the British system works, and supposedly Riley himself, and I'd be willing to believe, pointed this out to people in Moscow. He goes, look, a person like me, a polyglot, a Russian Jew who's pretending to be an Englishman with an Irish name, they might use me, but they're never going to bring me into the inner sanctum. I will never become part of this because the people who run this have gone to the right military ranks. They have the right social organization. The people who are going to go into... There's a class of people in Britain who run things and eventually will populate the higher positions, and those people go to Oxford and Cambridge. They have the right families to them. They are part of the British establishment. So to penetrate those organizations, to penetrate MI6, you must penetrate the British establishment. Which, of course, is exactly what they do with the Cambridge spy ring.
I was about to say Kim Philby.
Kim Philby. Yeah. And that is eventually what happens. I think that probably would have happened anyway, but this is what this whole sort of the trust of creating fake counter-revolutionary organizations that then recruit from white Russians abroad, but then use that to eventually make inroads into foreign intelligence agencies. That was the ultimate goal. Now, there's always a problem with that sort of thing, which Dzerzhinsky, the head of this, at least until he dropped dead in 1926, Dzerzhinsky, by the way, was never a fan of the trust operation. He didn't really like it. It was being pushed by people below him. And the reason he didn't like it is he said, well, it's one thing to go out and create phony opposition movements. And keep in mind that most of the people in this opposition movement will be real oppositionists. So you're going to create the monarchist organization of Central Russia. Well, to make that work, you're going to have to find some actual monarchists and get them to work for you. I mean, the more they believe it's true, the more they can sell it, right?
Yeah.
You only need a few people in key positions to keep things running along. But everyone else should probably actually... Well, he goes, here's the problem. What you've done is you've actually created a potentially real opposition movement. You collected all of these anti-Soviet monarchists and you put them together and you've given them money and you've sent them abroad, and they think that they're actually opposing the regime. And you've only got a few people who are in control of this. One of those people flips, something else happens,
right.
And a phony opposition movement can become a real opposition movement. So Dzerzhinsky thought this was something that had to be kept under very close control. Others wanted to do it more freely. But this is what's going on in the background. So a lot of this is all about controlling perception management and information management. Now, so that brings us back to the Soviets and Borah. So here is the reality. Borah, in the 1920s, had become Moscow's favorite American politician. They loved him because everything that he did in the Senate, especially his dogged promotion of recognition, was in their favor.
Yeah, what was his justification? Was it the outlawry of war stuff, or?
Well, Borah's justification, I mean, the argument that's generally given is he just thought it was practical. The idea was that, it would be ridiculous, many would argue, like Hal Ashby and others, that Borah was in any way a communist or a pro-communist, that he wasn't doing this for some sort of ideological reason, that he was doing it because, hold that thought, okay, as to whether or not there might have been an ideological component in it. Don't reject that. Never reject that out of hand.
Okay.
People are very good at disguising their ideology. Kim Philby passed himself off as a pro-fascist Francoite for years, when it should have been obvious to anyone that he was a communist, because they just didn't. You just point them in the kind of wrong direction. But the idea is that Borah was a pragmatist, and the thing is that this, maybe the Soviet regime will collapse 6 months from now or a year from now, which was always the prediction. This can't possibly last. This is unnatural. This is an affront to nature. The Bolsheviks are going to fall any day. And keep in mind, it was just what the Trust was selling. The idea, there's all kind of opposition. The regime is going to collapse. Everything's going, there's going to be this wonderful moderation. It will be whatever you want it to be. You want to imagine it where the Mensheviks are in control and now it's social democracy instead of communism? Yeah, it'll be that. You want the Tsar back in? Yeah, it'll be that. I don't know. You want it to be Eurasianist intellectuals in control? Sure. Yeah, we'll make it that too. Whatever you want, that's what it'll be. So what Borah could point out is that Americans are already doing business with Soviet Russia. Okay. There were hundreds of millions of dollars of exchange taking place. That whole process could be much simpler, that it would not be in the the Bolsheviks just aren't going to go away. All these predictions that they are going to vanish have not materialized. Maybe that will happen. Well, if it does, it will go from there. But there's simply no point in not having diplomatic relations with a country that consists of 1/6 of the world's land area, and which is an important place in which there's all kinds of economic potential for Americans and others. And the British and the French by this time, and the Germans, have all recognized them. Everybody else had. The U.S. is pretty much the holdout of this. So what this does, they argue, is it gives the British and the French, the Germans, our competitors, an advantage in dealing with Russia.
So yeah, it sounds extremely practical then.
Well, it also creates problems in travel, because it means that that Soviets traveling even on Soviet diplomatic papers, you're dealing with a passport that's issued by a government that technically your government doesn't recognize.
Yeah.
And therefore there's a reciprocal thing for Americans. You don't recognize us, we won't recognize you. Usually Americans didn't have a problem traveling there. But so Borah's idea is that it's pure pragmatism. Okay. And I can buy that. I think that's a portion of it as well. But let's consider the possibility that maybe let's not just dismiss let's not throw the ideological baby out with the bathwater just yet. So as I mentioned early on, Borah had kind of cut his teeth in terms of politics as a notable, if unsuccessful, prosecutor of radical labor organizers. One of whom, Bill Haywood, later essentially went over to the Bolsheviks. So you might think that Borah would be the last guy to be kind of pro-communist. Well, keep in mind, as prosecutor, that was his job. His job was to prosecute who it was that the state told him to. One of the things that might be a cause for some concern is Borah's friendship with Raymond Robbins.
Oh, is this the lawyer?
Well, Raymond Robbins was a mining entrepreneur.
Oh.
He was a guy who'd gotten, like in the Klondike and elsewhere.
Oh.
He was kind of a self-made, he was kind of if you've seen There Will Be Blood, he was a kind of a Daniel Plainview character.
Okay.
So he'd made money on his own. You could say that he was a self-made capitalist, but he also had very, what would be called progressive political ideas, mostly from a woman he had married, whose name is now going to escape me. But Mrs. Robbins was noted as a radical activist. She was a socialist, with a small s.
Yeah.
And Robbins was sympathetic to that. He had sort of aligned himself with the radical left, although he is a respected figure in business. And he's part of the American Red Cross delegation that goes to Russia in 1917, and is there when the revolution takes place, and has a number of other. William Boyce Thompson was another American businessman who's outspokenly pro-Bolshevik. I mean, he loves them. He thinks that, I think he's the guy it's either Thompson or Robbins, I can't remember which, who describes Trotsky as the greatest Jew since Christ. Okay, that's okay. And like Lenin is like Abraham Lincoln and George Washington and Jesus all rolled together. They can't say anything too good about that. Now that's different from what most other American officials are saying.
Yeah.
I mean, most of the ambassadors and consuls there are quite leery of the Bolsheviks, but Thompson and Robbins love them. And so when Robbins gets there, when the Bolsheviks come to power, Robbins is outspoken in his admiration. I mean, damn it, his love for the Bolshevik regime, and rapidly gains access to Soviet officialdom, and also becomes an active collaborator of the Bolshevik secret police. Okay. That's what Robbins does. And by active collaborator, I meant that he informed to the Cheka about the activities of other Americans.
Okay.
So any other Americans that Robbins came across, he always kept a secret, are they friends or enemies? So, and he denounced a couple of people. Got one, actually it was a Russian, a fellow by the name of Kolpashnikov, arrested. I mean, Kolpashnikov was guilty of what Robbins accused him, but the point was Robbins ratted him out.
Yeah.
So Robbins was from 1917, 1918 on an avowed pro-Soviet. He was, in doing so, I think, at the same time, it would be difficult to identify Robbins politically as a communist. He wasn't that either. He just liked them and generally approved of what it was that they did. And it's a thing which is, I think in the early 21st century is more difficult to get a grasp on. But if you go back to this, what it was that the Bolsheviks, the communists, stood for seemed to be the liberation of labor, the abolition of exploitation. You can come up with all of the terms. There were many people who, without being communist, who would never actually commit themselves to the idea or discipline of the party. They were members of what I always like to call, I'm not a communist, but club. Okay. I'm not a communist, but, they really stand for some good things. Their face is towards the light. That's the way that one of them put it. Is that the Bolsheviks' face is towards the light, and therefore and it's turned towards the same light that my face is turned towards.
So, like liberal Democrats would just cherry picking some of the parts of the party or actions that they deem acceptable, things that they would
we seem to stand for the same type of thing.
Yeah,
or maybe more, we seem to hate the same people.
Okay.
Maybe that's what.
Yeah. Well,
is that really
that binds people together more?
Yes. That's always the thing. Are you bound to someone because you like the same things or because you hate the same things?
Yeah.
And I would be willing to say that I've had entire semi-relationships with people, the only basis of which was that we hated the same people. Well, we didn't hate them. We dislike them intensely.
I think the enemy of my enemy is my friend stuff goes.
Yeah, I think that was a portion of it.
Yeah.
So there is, the other term which is used for this is fellow travelers.
Yep.
Okay. And here again, that's not a myth.
Yeah.
There is this whole class of people in the West, you can find them in the U.S. and elsewhere, who, while never becoming communists themselves, they would never commit themselves in that way, tended to view with general favor what the communists did.
They're pink.
Yeah. I mean, they would even acknowledge certain things. There's one fellow I made around mentioning too who would give a report on the Soviets, and he'd argue, well, the regime is repressive at home and subversive abroad. Okay.
That's true.
Which is a simple statement of fact.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
I mean, and even Lenin wouldn't deny that. Is he going to say that we're not subversive abroad? And,
No.
And we have to be,
Right.
we have to be repressive at home because we have enemies.
Yeah.
Therefore, we must repress them. That's why we have a secret police. So, but then that same guy, a guy named Arthur Bullard, maybe we'll come back to him, who had gone to Russia also in 1917 as a kind of a semi-official emissary of the U.S. government, and then had worked in the State Department for a while, and then went to work for the League of Nations, that Bullard would make that statement that the Soviet regime is repressive at home and subversive abroad, but then go on to write the report arguing that recognition and dealing with them is the only sensible thing to do. That is exactly the same thing. Is exactly the same as Borah was saying. But that also is a tactic in propaganda, is that don't deny what is undeniable.
Sure.
I mean, don't deny the fact that you execute political opponents. Simply argue that we have no choice but to execute political opponents because these people are dangerous. If we didn't kill them, they would kill us. So yeah, do we do things that might be regarded as repressive, but for the right cause, comrade, for the right cause, for the ultimate? Remember, the whole idea Dzerzhinsky and the secret police was motivated by was that which serves the interests of the revolution is good, that which opposes the interests of the revolution is bad.
What's the Aquino? Well, that's another. Well, once you achieve godhood, then morals of right and wrong look much different.
You're God. You just do whatever you want.
You have to do bad things to get.
I think I'll sink that continent. Why not?
Yeah.
Or make another one come up. Okay. Dogs and cats dancing together. Whatever you want. So, other abominations abound. So yes, it's one of the things to look for is that, don't try to deny it. You're not really going to deny. If you're trying to promote world revolution, you're subversive abroad. So, and I've seen someone argue was that Arthur Bullard couldn't, in that case, have been promoting Soviet interests because he said bad things about them. Well, he only admitted what couldn't be denied, and then he went on to essentially argue that cooperation is the only way forward. That's just what you have to do out of practicality.
Yeah.
So, but that's something to keep in mind, is that someone can disguise an ideological motivation by casting it in the realm of being an objective consideration that's just practical.
Right.
Now it is. It's just practical, but it's also what it is that I ideologically am sympathetic to.
Realpolitik smuggles in your actual.
But if I try to sell that to you ideologically, then you would become suspicious.
Sure.
If I just sell it to you as a practical necessity, well, then it all seems to be objective. Appearing to be objective when you are not. Does that sound familiar to anybody? All right. So, the trust. Now, one of the questions so this whole trust operation is going on, trying to influence abroad. Did the trust? Did the Soviets have any, other than thinking that Borah was a great guy because he's advancing? In fact, the statement in Moscow was a letter of introduction from William Borah is worth more than a letter of introduction from the Secretary of State.
Not master of the Senate.
So if you were an American and you wanted to meet the right people in Moscow, you went and you got a letter from Borah, even though he'd never been there. And that he was, as far as thinking, he is our guy, and that would open doors. Secretary of State, no. The Secretary of State, Kelly or otherwise, were essentially enemies. They opposed recognition. Therefore, that doesn't, we just accept them as functionaries, no more than that. So they really liked him, which meant that they wanted to protect him. So one of the things, back in the 1990s, the wild and woolly 1990s, after the fall of the USSR, and a lot of archives in Russia were more open than they are now. I mean, for like 15 minutes, everything was open. That didn't last very long. They've been shutting that stuff down ever since. But I found some interesting stuff in the party archive. So the party, this isn't the KGB archive, because you don't get into that.
Do you speak Russian?
I can't speak it worth dog poop.
But you can read it?
But I can read.
Okay. I was always curious when you tell these stories about going up there and looking at archives.
I can make myself barely understood, I think.
Okay.
I imagine so as time goes on. But yeah, I can read through this stuff. And so it's, so this was a lot of communicating in Pidgin Russian with people in the archives, okay, and then getting the materials. So, but in the party archive, you had personal fonds of different figures. And one of those was the personal fond of Felix Dzerzhinsky, the founder and leader of the Cheka, the Soviet secret police. And so while this is not the KGB archives per se, because you've got to be God to get there, it made reference to them and would have some things in it. It was stuff that had been sent back and forth between Dzerzhinsky by his key lieutenants. And this is where there was the discussion of Dzerzhinsky's uneasiness with the trust under the possibility that you may be creating phony underground organizations that could turn into real underground opposition organizations. But one of the things that came up in this, the kind of pay dirt came across, was discussions of Borah. And so he's getting, this includes documents from two key figures in the secret police were a fellow by the name of Mikhail Trilisser, who actually headed a thing, I think at this time called the INO, which was the Foreign Intelligence, which was specifically based upon intelligence operations abroad. And then Artuzov, who was head of a thing called the KRO, which was the Internal Security Organization, sort of like MI6, MI5. Okay. So the KRO is ferreting out counter-revolutionaries and foreign spies inside the country. The INO is creating subversives and spying on people outside of Russia. So they at one point talk about the assets they have around Borah.
Okay, that makes sense.
Now, nowhere in these documents does it say anything about we paid him money.
Yeah, but you're handling
it.
him.
Does mention that he was accused of taking money and that was a dangerous accusation. It also never says anywhere that we didn't give him money. I mean, that point isn't really discussed. And you could argue that if we all know that we did give him money, then we don't have to talk about that, do we? The problem is that he's been accused of this. That accusation has come up. And the other thing that we need to do, this is what I thought interesting, is that we need to influence him.
Yeah.
We need to have people around him, people he knows, who can influence him. And they give names of some of those people. One of them is a journalist. And the journalist's name is given two ways. One is they simply refer to him as D. And in other cases, D seems to become Dickers or Deckers. So it's an interesting thing. When Russians spell Western names, they'll usually spell in the Cyrillic alphabet, they'll spell them phonetically. So it won't necessarily, I mean, the alphabets are different to begin with, so there's no exact letter, but they'll often go what it sounds like in that regard. So one of those names that comes up is Bellard. The way they spell it is Bellard in Cyrillic. But as you go through this, it's very clear that they're talking about that guy that I just mentioned, Arthur Bullard. The American official for the Committee on Public Information, which was the American propaganda outfit set up during World War I by Wilson. and then the fellow who was the head of the Russian Bureau, because they identify him as, for a time, the head of the Russian Bureau in the State Department, and that's Bullard.
Okay.
Now, Bullard had been kind of left-leaning all the way back in 1917 and 1918. Never a communist. I don't think he ever kind of went that. But he's the same guy I just mentioned who would write the report saying that, yeah, they're repressive at home, subversive abroad, but we need to practically do business with them. Well, it turns out, according to their own documents, that he was considered to be an agent of the trust, that he was considered to be a Soviet asset. So
what and consider just means like he's pro our position, or we're actively doing.
Well, the question is, does that mean that we're paying him to do this, or is he simply doing this out of? Well, it goes back to that old acronym of MICE. Okay, why do people spy? Why do people cooperate with intelligence agencies? And it goes back to money, ideology, compromise, ego. Sometimes a combination of them. So in Bullard's case, it could have been money. That's always simplest. That's why it's at the front. It could be ideological. Compromise is always a possibility. I don't see that is necessary in this case. And then ego, that could play a part in it as well. But you always have to keep those, and see, the same thing could be asked about Borah, if you want to assume.
Sure.
Was it purely the money? Was it because, I mean, you could put together two things there. One, $100,000 for a man who was constantly complaining about needing money. Mm-hmm. And who, by the way, at the time of his death, will leave a mysteriously large estate that no one could figure out. Oh. He left like $250,000. And the idea was that, well, that was just, he was thrifty and he made some wise investments. What investments exactly? Okay. What I've never seen is, where exactly did that money come from? Because you should be able to trace it. If it was investments, you should be able to track the dividends on that every year. And it's just kind of, well, that's where it must have come from, because, he was just too honorable of a guy. So this is the other thing you need to say, that it is impossible that this person did this thing that they have been accused of doing because they just wouldn't do it. Mm-hmm. William Borah would never do that. He would never take money from the Russians to advance their cause. No matter how much he needed money, and Lord knows he needed it, would he do that? Well, that's not logic. Okay. That's just because you like the guy and you're trying to make an excuse as to why he do it, because he's just too much of a prince of a human being to do that time, which could be true.
Well, I would say in the state of Idaho, particularly, given its politics, I think there's no surprise to most people from the outside. They probably think it's a little more extreme than it is. But to say that one of the, leading lights of Idaho politics is a secret commie probably wouldn't go over very well. So,
well, nobody would want, no one on this end really, well, there were a few, but no one of any kind of prominence would really want to promote that idea. And which isn't to argue that it is necessarily true, but I'm not sure. Well, we'll have to wait to get to the end. Okay. And we'll see how all of this comes out. So Soviets really like Borah. They do have people around him. Bullard is one. There are a couple of others who are mentioned. One of the things also is that sometimes they're using the real names, and in other cases are using code names. This is also another thing that will become confusing later on in things like the Venona documents from World War II. Sometimes they'll just use the person's name. Usually that means they're not very important. But the key person in Borah is obviously this D or Deckers, a journalist who may be of British origin, a journalist who has been posted to Moscow. If you look at this, who does that fit to a T? Walter Duranty. Mm-hmm. And sure enough, Borah knew Duranty. And they do communicate with each other. They correspond on a regular basis. So the D or Now, the only other person that could come up was with an American journalist based out of Chicago named Arthur Decker. And he sort of did the European beat, but I can't
Sure.
place him in Russia. I can't place him anywhere in the same room, any kind of connection with Borah. So I am 99% certain that the D or Deckers mentioned in this is Walter Duranty.
Okay.
But then notice, who else does Walter Duranty connect to? His protege, Hubert Knickerbocker. Okay. So think about this. Duranty, from Soviet documents themselves, is considered to be a Soviet asset who is assigned to influence and monitor Borah. Borah comes under attack as having been in the pay of the Soviets. In short order, Duranty's junior, his protege, Knickerbocker, brings suit in Berlin against other Soviet agents, accusing him of selling him incriminating documents against Borah, and it all goes into a public trial where those documents are demonstrated to be what? Fakes. So that's all sort of working together. So at the very least, what you have here is that the Soviet secret police was aware of the accusations against Borah. They wanted to discredit those accusations. And basically, their way of doing that, when you put these pieces together, is that they orchestrate this whole dog and pony show in Berlin. And so I don't think that Knickerbocker just decided to look into this case accidentally. I think that was suggested to him by Duranty, and that was suggested to him by the Cheka. And this was all to create a public trial at a suitable foreign venue in which the accusations would once again be shown in a German court to be unproven and false. Keep in mind, nobody gets punished for it. The culprits just walk free out of the courtroom, continue doing what they were doing before. So, and everyone at Pavlovsky, Orlov, Knickerbocker, all of them are essentially doing what it is that the Soviets want them to do. Now, that still leaves us with an interesting question, though. Remember I said that this whole thing began back in 1927 with these documents that show up in Paris that somebody wanted $50,000 for? The documents that Knickerbocker then, in which there was this whole, again, play enacted to conjure in Berlin. So where did those eventually come from? Well, mention the fact that Borah had enemies, and that one of the enemies he had was a fellow by the name of Louis Pearsons. And Louis Pearsons was the head of the Liberty National Bank. And that was a bank that actually was involved in some business deals with the Soviets. But Pearsons didn't like Borah. He thought that he was a communist dupe. He thought he was solving the interests of the Bolsheviks, which, kind of, well, the Soviets thought the same thing, didn't they? Isn't saying that this guy is a great guy, we're going to influence what he's doing, is that he's our dupe. So again, Borah could be just totally, unaware and innocent in all of these type of things. Okay. It's not so that he isn't motivated by anything other than doing what he thought was practical. But it isn't necessarily that way. Remember, again, history is a narrative. So what narrative do you want to have here? Is the narrative that Borah is just sort of being quietly manipulated by people around him? But by the way, there are also two other names that appear to be code names that are used of people who come in contact with him, who report back to Moscow about what Borah is thinking and about what he is doing. Mm-hmm. Now, how is he feeling today? Because they wanted to. And one of the things they mentioned is this is a guy who could become president. We can have a pro-Soviet president in Washington if we continue to back Borah. So Louis Pearsons hated Borah. I think it's fair enough to say that. Thought that he was a communist dupe. He was doing disinterest to capitalism and to the country. And Pearson's had created his own kind of private intelligence service. Based where? In Paris. And in fact, one of the people who was involved in this, his chief agent in Paris, just happened to be the American military attaché, a fellow by the name of T. Bentley Mott. And T. Bentley Mott had, during World War I, had been the liaison officer between General Pershing, the head of the American Expeditionary Force, and Field Marshal Ferdinand Foch, the Supreme Allied Commander. I don't know how many people know that the Supreme Allied Commander in World War I was a Frenchman. Okay. But that was Foch. So he was, he had good connections with French officials and military and intelligence services. And what Mott had done is to create this kind of network of agents in Paris. Now, one of the interesting things about Pearson's and Mott, apparently, and other people, is that they're all Freemasons. Okay, I told you it's going to come in. And also, apparently, connected to the Martinist lodges in Paris.
Interesting.
So the Martinists are one of these kind of occult orders that supposedly goes back to the 18th century. It was really invented in the 19th century, and it involves people like, the Tsar's first spiritual guru, Papus, was a Martinist, and also vaguely connects to synarchy. Just see when you go Martinism and synarchy are kind of joined at the hip.
Yeah.
So how interesting that when you get into this, sooner or later, that I think is how the whole thing was organized. That Pearson's intelligence service, that maybe he was part of himself, maybe he ran, that isn't clear, but that's where he was getting his information. That this was essentially governed as a kind of fraternal or secret society in some form, probably masquerading as some kind of Masonic organization. Which again, think of this as another example as to how an outwardly Masonic or esoteric organization could double as the front for espionage. So what happens is that Pearson pops up. So remember, the whole case in Berlin had been concluded in July 1929. Apparently it's all over with. A couple of months later, in September 1929, Pearson's now writes to Herbert Hoover in Washington, and he goes, I have new documentation proving that Borah, and Norris took $100,000 from the Soviets. But in the process of this, he also acknowledges that I and my organization were the source of those original documents that came up back in 1927. So those copies of the documents, and so we didn't want to display our hand. So we pretended they were just people who were going to sell them. But if you just asked for them, we would have given you the originals. And where did we get the originals from? Well, we stole them from the office of Dudley Field Malone. Now you probably wondering, okay, I'm trying to keep track of the characters. So who's Dudley Field Malone? Dudley Field Malone is an American lawyer. Was initially a big booster of Woodrow Wilson. Then he kind of soured on Woodrow Wilson because Dudley Field Malone also sort of veered towards the left, towards progressive causes, and he became a great defender of women's suffrage. So one of the things forgotten is that Woodrow Wilson was not a fan of women's suffrage, and this is back when Alice Paul and other gals were protesting, and they were being kidnapped, and they would go on hunger strikes, and they'd be force-fed by having funnels put down their throat and food. Okay. Pretty nasty stuff. And so Dudley Field Malone sort of does this flip-flop. He comes to the defense of the fairer sex as he sees it, and he becomes a legal champion of the suffragists. He actually runs for the mayor of New York in 1920 on the Farm Labor Party, loses, does not become that. But then in 1919, he also becomes the American legal representative of the Soviet Government Bureau in New York, led by Ludwig Martens. So, remember, there's no mutual recognition. But what happened in 1919 is that on Lenin's orders, a thing called the Russian Soviet Government Bureau is set up in New York under Martens, who's also a sort of German Russian, and that becomes the kind of unofficial embassy. It also becomes a center of espionage and propaganda. And that's why in 1920 it's shut down by the U.S. government, and Martins and everyone else in it is deported, or they leave on their own. But Dudley Field Malone was the American lawyer representing them. So again, Dudley Field Malone isn't a communist, but he is quite favorable towards them. He also does a lot of things. He's the co-counsel in the infamous Scopes monkey trial.
Oh, really?
In the early 20s. Yeah, and he at one point actually takes over. This is Clarence Darrow against William Jennings Bryan.
Yeah.
Also, Dudley Field Malone had briefly been, at the beginning of the Wilson administration, the third Assistant Secretary of State.
The third?
Under William Jennings Bryan.
Okay.
And then some years later, he will come back on the opposite legal team to Bryan in the Scopes monkey trial. Malone is a very interesting guy. He argued at that trial he gave one of the greatest speeches in legal history. I don't know, you'd have to read it and judge for yourself. On that, he then goes to Paris in the 20s, and he sets up an international divorce bureau.
Oh, this is okay.
It was generally called a divorce mill. It was the European version of Reno. Okay, so if you wanted to get a divorce and you wanted to keep it out of American papers, you went to Paris, and Dudley Field Malone basically specialized in high-profile, profitable divorce cases for Americans in Paris.
See, that's the kind of business I got to start. It's like, nice.
He later gets into one of these things where he's like the Vanderbilts.
Oversaw
one. It all has to do with the custody of the daughter, Gloria Vanderbilt.
Okay.
Now, those who remember the 70s might remember Gloria Vanderbilt jeans. That's the woman who was the little girl in the trial in which her mother was represented, who's also named Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, by Dudley Field Malone. And then again, he was a Churchill impersonator. And would play him in movies. He repeatedly went bankrupt, was married many times, was colorful. Dudley Field Malone was colorful. So according to Pearson's and his intelligence service, if any of this is true, they had been able to infiltrate Malone's office and had stolen these materials, including that receipt, that 1926 receipt, off of Malone's desk. So, and Pearson surfaces again just a couple of months after the whole case in Berlin and goes, I have more stuff to go from. Nobody seems to be too interested in it. Hoover doesn't really bite on this. The whole issue had been done. But the most interesting revelation in that is that Pearson says that, we were the ones behind the original documents when they showed up. Now, Pearson's, by the way, still insists that the original documents are real. He never retreats from that. And he also mentions a couple of other names. He produces, one of the things that he sends to Hoover is a supposed letter between Borah and the Soviet ambassador in Paris, a guy by the name of Valerian Dovgalevsky. So Valerian Dovgalevsky is... and Borah writes to him complaining about all of the stuff that had gone, all of these documents occurred because Malone is an idiot and he left these things just lying around on his desk, and how that's they were to get them. Now, there's a lot of questions about that letter. Would Borah write to the Soviet ambassador directly? I mean, there's always this thing. I mean, everybody out there knows the rule on things, right? If it's a sensitive matter, never put it in writing. Okay, do not keep a diary. Don't post all that stuff on Facebook, because it can all come back to haunt you. So that creates a kind of paper trail, which even then was problematic. The question here is whether Pearson's and his crew are themselves just another forgery mill. I mean, Pearson's, in his letters, seems to really believe this, but I'm not sure that he hasn't just convinced himself that it's true and is perfectly willing to come up. He's perfectly willing to fake documents that, again, just prove what he wants to be true anyway. Or maybe he's referring things that actually exist. He does mention some kind of interesting names in the process of this. So one of the things that Pearson's notes is that there were things in the transcript of the original trial in Berlin. Now, there was a whole copy of that in German that was acquired by the State Department. So one of the things I was able to get out of the State Department archives was essentially a transcript of the Berlin trial. I mean, most of it isn't all that interesting, but there are parts that were edited out in the American version. And those parts that are edited out are things later on that could in any way sort of lead back to the American military attaché in Paris, the Bentley Mott character. So those type of things are left out. What that means is that someone in state knew that Mott was involved in this, and they didn't want that mentioned anywhere. They weren't even going to let. One of the things that Borah noted when he saw the transcript is that there were part that there were, and they told him, well, these are names that have to be redacted for certain reasons, but no one was supposed to be trusted with that. So there's some kind of collusion between the State Department and Pearson's, but one of the names he mentions is Sergei Markatun. And I knew I'd run across that name somewhere else. Sergei Markatun is a white Russian émigré who, on the other hand, not a Bolshevik, but he's working at the Soviet embassy in Paris. So he's working in the embassy and being run by Dovgilevsky. And Pearson says that Markatun is our source inside the Russian embassy. And that's how we got a hold of this letter. Okay. So we got a hold of Borah's receipt because it was stolen by another one of our people off of Dudley Field Malone's desk. And now Markatun, my Martinist Masonic brother, as he notes, was able to get this inside the embassy.
Yeah.
Markatun is an obscure but a kind of real character. And he again sort of shows up in mentions of various French, the Martinist and occult societies in Paris. Definitely not. I don't know why he's working in the Soviet embassy. I don't even know if that's entirely accurate. He may have had a source inside of it, but it's an odd name to bring in. It's a real person, but a fairly obscure one. And then another name he mentioned is a Soviet economist by the name of Aaron Scheinman. And that Aaron Scheinman was I don't know, kind of the Soviets' chief accountant in this period. He handled a lot of foreign accounts. One of them is connected with so Scheinman, for instance, makes a visit to New York, and on that visit to New York, he's also visited by William Borah. Okay, so Borah does sort of know Scheinman. Scheinman's closely connected to a thing called the Commercial Bank for the Commercial Bank for Northern Europe, or for the countries of Northern Europe. It's a bank. It's a Soviet front bank. It handles hard Western currency going to Russia and back and forth. That is also then connected to, it's also a bank which is used by the League of Nations for various accounts. Interesting. And who is the person who's working for the League of Nations at this time? Arthur Bullard. Remember the guy who thought the Soviets were oppressive and subversive, but so you needed to do business with them. And another trust agent, person who's acknowledged as being one of their assets. So what you've got here is this whole, what Bullard controlled or had access to were bank accounts in Switzerland and elsewhere used by the League of Nations. Remember, the League of Nations is in Switzerland. It's using Swiss banks. And then you have this commercial bank for Northern Europe, which is a Soviet front, which is also... So there are these references to real people who are part of this whole secret Soviet money laundering system, the system of bank accounts, Western bank accounts that are controlled by them, which is another sort of rabbit hole we're not going to go into. But there's a lot of this stuff of money which is basically being moved into the Soviet Union, and then assets, in some cases gold, bullion, diamonds, or elsewhere, that are being deposited, being placed in safe deposit boxes in these banks. So there's a whole system of moving these things around and disguising where it came from. So, what all of this comes down to is that, was Edgar Borah in Soviet pay or not? And here's the simple answer: I don't know. Or a little more to the point, I'm not sure. There's a fair amount of evidence here on each side of the equations, none of which is convincing. What is undoubtedly the case is that the Soviets were aware of Boris and saw him as a tool to be cultivated by assets around him. So Borah was definitely under the influence of Soviet agents in the period in which he was advancing recognition and other pro-Soviet causes in Washington. Was there a mechanism through which money might have been paid to him more or less untraceably? Yes, there was. And in some of those names, in the case of Scheinman and the banks involved, and in Bullard, and even in Dudley Field Malone, you have that process. So I'd say the question, it still stands as an accusation, and while I think it's more, in terms of actually taking money, it's more likely not to be true, I wouldn't discount it that it was a possibility. And one of those things you just can't quite be sure of. But it does show, if nothing else, the kind of influence which, even in this period of non-recognition, that Soviet intelligence and operations had. They did have a figure high in the position of the U.S. government that they were actively influencing. Now, one of the things to kind of wrap up with here, I mentioned earlier that there was a case of counterfeiting. So one of the things that was very useful to Soviet operations abroad was because you couldn't use rubles to do it. Nobody would take rubles, not even communists. You needed money. Well, you had to go through things like, selling Fabergé eggs, doing a number of things to collect dollars or pounds, whatever they were, sort of real Western currency you could exchange. But then around 1928, 1929, the same time that the Borah stuff is going on, which is interesting, the idea came out, well, there's another thing we can do. We can counterfeit it. So let's counterfeit a bunch of American $50 and $100 bills. And we have really good counterfeiting, and they did. So, beginning around 1928, 1929, a large cache of nearly perfect forged U.S. $100 bills, maybe some 50s as well. I've some cases they just mentioned $100 were created in the Chekkas, the NKVD, KGB's forgery apparatus, and they were very good. And they started out by passing them in Eastern Europe, in Bulgaria and Romania. And that because part of it was that, Bulgarians would take a $100 bill and they didn't see a lot of them. And then by the time that would actually make its way back to the States and it might be detected, months could pass. So that went actually pretty well. So what you needed, though, was a kind of apparatus to do all of this stuff. And here again is where you have one of these people who is an example as something I mentioned earlier, the kind of Russian American or American Russian, someone who was born in Russia, came to the United States, worked there, became Americanized to some degree, and then later came back and either lived in Russia. And the particular person here is a fellow by the name of Nick Dosenberg. And Nick Dosenberg, or Nicholas Dosenberg, was born in Latvia, so he's not Russian, he's Latvian. Which show up quite prominently. They're very prominent in the secret police for some reason. And so Dosenberg had come to the U.S., around 1904, 1905. He'd become active in the American labor movement, joined the Socialist Party, joined a thing called the sort of Latvian segment. One of the things that the American Socialist Party did is that it organized sort of national groups, because a very large part of its membership was composed of immigrants, what Wilson would call hyphenated Americans. Latvian Americans, Hungarians, Russians, Jews, whatever.
American ethnics.
And so the idea was to organize these people into what were called language associations, so that you would then deal with political materials in Finnish or Latvian or whatever it might be. When the Socialist Party in 1918, 1919 split and the left wing became the Communist Party, that's something to keep in mind. There was an American Socialist Party, Debs's party.
Yep.
That split, and the left wing became the Communist Party of America. And the other part sort of remained the Socialist Party that withered away. And the language associations generally joined the Communist Party. So Dosenberg became Communist Party. He then, later went back to Russia for some kind of training there. But he was, for all practical purposes, an American. He was an American citizen, and that was handy to have. He had a passport. Mm-hmm. He could move around as an American as opposed to a Soviet. So Dosenberg was basically recruited into, I think the guys handling this are Soviet military intelligence, which is a separate thing called the GRU. Really, in some ways, more effective than the Cheka. And because they're usually after, a lot of that has to do with sort of economic espionage, technology acquisition and transfer. So they said, look, this is what we need you to do. I want you to go to Romania. I want you to set up this company. We're going to give you some money to do that. And it's going to be called the Romanian American Film Company. Okay, and it's all going to be about distributing American films in Romania. And that'll be kind of a cover for that. But that's just going to be, and that's actually where we're going to experimentally pass some of these phony hundreds, along with real bills we have, to see whether they'll pass muster. And then you go back to the States, and then you open a branch of this company there, and now it can transfer funds back and forth. It will have bank accounts. And so this Romanian American film, it could be the American Romanian Film Company, I can't remember, but you get the gist of it. And now you create business fronts. And this is almost always the way that Soviet espionage, you would create business fronts. I think Dosenberg is connected to another one in Paris, which has the intriguing name of the Autonomous Society for the Importation of Grain. Okay. It's just a Société Anonyme. It just means a kind of limit, a corporation. But if you translate it in English, it's the Anonymous Society for the Importation of Grain. But this was, who would pay any attention to that? That can't possibly. I want to start a band called that. Can't possibly be a Russian espionage front. Well, another guy that gets recruited into this, another American, also of Russian origin, is a New York cardiologist. Now, the interesting thing about these, you tend to look at a lot of the people who were recruited for Soviet espionage in the States, is that they're not like, embittered bronze working men from steel mills in Pennsylvania. Power. No, they're doctors and lawyers. Yeah, okay. I mean, the Julius Hammer, Armand Hammer's commie dad, was a successful physician.
Yeah.
So they tend to be, in other words, a successful chiropractor. I mean, they're the people who actually have. Right. So Dr. Valentin Burtan was recruited also to pass some of this money in the States. And he recruits someone else to assist him. The guy he recruits to assist him was a German whose real name was Heinrich Deckhoff from Berlin, which I've always tried to figure out whether Deckhoff had anything to do with this whole sort of crowd in Berlin. Can't connect him. But in the States, he went by a different name. First of all, he called himself Henry, and then he started calling himself Count Enrique von Bülow. Jeez. So, as Count Enrique von Bülow, around 1927-28, he married a woman 20 years elder who had a small fortune in Chicago.
Makes sense.
And then she kept trying to divorce him because she found out he was a fraud, but then she would cancel the divorce. He apparently, right after she decided to divorce him one time, they were robbed. Or she was robbed. Some guys posing as census takers knocked on the door and then burst in and robbed her of $50,000 in gems. He walked in at the last minute, and they took $20 from him and hit him on the head. The police suspected that her estranged hubby, boy toy, was somehow to blame for this. In the same way that they suspected that 2 months later, when 2 bullets were fired through her bedroom window, nearly miskilling her, that he was also behind. She would never hear of this. Because she goes, he may be a fraud, he may be a crook, he may be many things, but he would never try to kill me. Anyway, so he seems to have just been a con man and a crook.
Right, dog.
But he's the guy that Bertan. So what they do is that they basically pass $100,000. Interesting, that term. $100,000 of fake $100 bills in Chicago banks. That gets quickly detected, and they are arrested and go on trial. And so it's a counterfeiting ring. So if you look at the newspaper reports of this, there's some kind of international counterfeiting ring. We don't actually know who's behind it. A couple of these bills had shown up in the Balkans before. There's no mention of the Soviets in it, but that's what was behind it. What was behind the whole thing was a counterfeiting ring by the Soviet secret police to see if they could pass American bills, and they had some success. And when they tried it, however, in American banks, it was quickly detected and they were caught, or someone ratted them out, because this stuff was detected very, very quickly. So there's a whole story within this counterfeiting portion of it, which is, yet to be discovered, I suppose. So there's a little glimpse into political intrigue and to espionage with just a touch of bizarre Martinist Freemasonry added in. But I would bet it's certainly a side of history and even of Borah that you may never have heard of. But always keep these things in mind. History is a lot stranger than it seems.